Welcome to today's story of a notorious serial killer. I'm going to tell you about a particularly cunning criminal, a man of high intelligence and striking good looks. Starting in January 1974, a series of attacks on women began in Seattle, Washington. The suspect was believed to be a masked man who would sneak into women's homes in the dead of night. He would club them unconscious and assault them. For 6 months, nearly every month, a young woman would be reported missing. The perpetrator gradually escalated his crimes, moving from burglaries and assaults to murder. His victims were almost always young, attractive college students with long center-parted hair. Always wearing a mask, he carefully covered his tracks, making it difficult for the police to progress with their investigation. In June 1974, a young woman named Jorgen Hawkins vanished in an alleyway on her way home one night. The next day, after receiving a missing person report, the police searched the alley but found nothing. Witnesses reported seeing a man on crutches near where the woman had disappeared. He was carrying a briefcase and had a cast on his leg. Due to the limited clues, the police were unable to identify this man. Jorgen's family, who were journalists, publicized the case, drawing public attention. It turned out that a string of young women had been disappearing in Seattle over the past 6 months, causing widespread alarm among residents. Police investigations revealed that many of the disappearances coincided with university exam periods. The locations of the disappearances were often near construction sites, where witnesses reported seeing a man on crutches driving a Beetle. Given the similarities between the cases, the police believed that the same person was responsible for all of them. On July 14, 1974, 5 young women were vacationing at Sammamish State Park when they encountered a handsome man in a white tennis outfit. One of his arms was in a sling, and he introduced himself as Ted. Claiming he needed help, he asked them to assist him in removing a sailboat from his car. 4 of the women declined, but a 23-year-old woman agreed to help. She followed him to his car, but quickly realized something was wrong when she found no sailboat. Remembering the recent disappearances, she turned and ran to a more populated area. Her alertness allowed her to escape. On the same day, 2 more women were reported missing from the park. Many witnesses claimed to have seen a suspicious man with a bandaged arm. The police created a sketch of the suspect based on the witnesses' descriptions and plastered them all over Seattle. They also received hundreds of reports each day, one of which pointed to the same suspect. That person was Ted Bundy, a 28-year-old local university student with excellent grades and no criminal record. The police showed Ted's photo to 8 other witnesses from the park, but 7 of them said it wasn't him. The police also believed that someone like Ted could hardly commit such a crime, and since there was no evidence, they let him go. In fact, during high school, he had been arrested several times for theft, but when he became an adult, those criminal records were inexplicably erased. Sometime later, a hiker reported to the police that he had discovered a skeleton 3 kilometers from Sammamish State Park. After receiving the report, the police went there and found 2 more skeletons, making a total of 3. It was confirmed that they were all the young women who had been reported missing recently, one of whom was the missing college student Jorgen. After the series of cases in Seattle, there were also many cases of missing women in Salt Lake City, Utah. Around that time, the bodies of 2 naked women were found in the woods. The victims had many bruises and signs of sexual assaults, suggesting that they had been assaulted after death. The cause of death was suffocation. The perpetrator was very careful, and he cleaned up the crime scene very thoroughly, so the police collected very little evidence. At that time, Police departments in the United States did not share information, so they did not know that the series of cases in Seattle, Washington, that the recent cases in Salt Lake City were actually carried out by the same person. On November 8, 1974, on a rainy night, a woman suddenly burst into the Salt Lake City police station in Utah to report a crime. The woman, named Carol Deronche, was an 18-year-old telephone operator. She said that after work that day, she was planning to drive to a bookstore to read when a handsome man approached her. He claimed to be a police officer and said that someone was trying to steal her car. Carol didn't know how he found her, but she still decided to follow the man to the parking lot. Along the way, Carol felt suspicious and asked to see his identification, but the man just smiled and ignored her. When they arrived at the parking lot, she discovered that her car was indeed missing. The man then suggested that the car might have been towed away and asked her to go to the nearby security post to file a report. Carol hesitated for a moment, then, anxious to recover her car, she accompanied the man to a nearby secluded building. But still, the car was nowhere to be found. At that time, the man said that the car might have been taken to the police station and that he could drive her there. On the way, Carol realized that the direction they were heading was not towards the police station. She sensed something was wrong and asked to get out. The man slowly stopped the car, and at that moment, he suddenly grabbed her hand, pulled out a gun, and pointed it at her head. He threatened to kill her. However, Carol opened the door, jumped out of the car, and ran away from him. Coincidentally, at that moment, a car passed by. She immediately stopped the car and asked them to take her to the police station to report the incident. After some investigations, the police found several suspects, including Ted Bundy. Carol took one look at the photos of the suspects and immediately recognized him. The police's suspicion of Ted grew stronger. Back in Washington, the police received a call from Elizabeth Kloepfer, Ted Bundy's girlfriend. This was not the first time she had reported to the police. A few months earlier, she had reported a missing person case at Sammamish State Park, but the police had not taken it seriously at the time. After hearing about the disappearances in Salt Lake City, she again accused her boyfriend, Ted Bundy, to the police. This time, the police opened an investigation into him and discovered that Ted's travel routes coincided with the locations of the disappearances. But beyond that, there was no other evidence. On August 16, 1975, while patrolling the road, a Utah police officer accidentally spotted a beetle driving slowly in a residential area, which looked very suspicious. Upon noticing the police patrol, he immediately turned and tried to escape, but was stopped by the police car. The police officer found that the passenger seat of the beetle had been removed, and there was a ski mask, crowbar, handcuffs, rope, and other tools in the car, and the driver was none other than Ted. He claimed that the ski mask was for skiing, the handcuffs were found by him in a trash can, and the rest were just everyday items. He said he was going to watch a movie that night, so he was passing by. The police officer expressed doubt about his answer. After notifying the command center, the police officers learned that Ted was linked to several major cases, so they took him to the police station. Investigators searched his residence, but found nothing. Ted was later released for lack of evidence. To solve the case, the Washington police compiled the files of all the recently missing girls and compiled detailed information. They also listed the suspects, and Ted Bundy's name was on that list. Ted Bundy was born in November 1946. His real name was Theodore Robert Cowell. His mother became pregnant with him out of wedlock, and his biological father abandoned them. Ted's maternal family was deeply religious and frowned upon out-of-wedlock pregnancies. After giving birth at a maternity home, his mother left him there. Ted's maternal grandfather, unable to bear the sight of his grandson in such circumstances, took him to Philadelphia and raised him as his own son. To avoid gossip, he asked the family to keep Ted's identity a secret. Naturally, Ted was also unaware of his true origins. Ted's grandfather was a violent, paranoid, and deeply racist man who often resorted to violence to solve problems. Under his grandfather's influence, Ted exhibited some strange behaviors from a young age. For instance, while his family was napping, he would sneak into the kitchen, grab a knife, place it beside them while they slept, and stand by the bed, smiling contentedly. As a child, Ted often looked at his grandfather's pornographic magazines, and his distorted psychology must have formed from there. In 1950, when he was 4 years old, his birth mother came to take him away and brought him to Western Washington. A year later, his mother remarried and had 4 more children, but Ted struggled to fit in with his new family. Throughout his high school years, Ted was a loner and didn't like socializing with others. He often wandered the streets alone, rummaging through garbage cans in the hope of finding discarded pulp magazines. Sometimes, he would lie on other people's windows at night and peek at women taking a bath. At home, he enjoyed reading detective and crime novels. In 1965, at the age of 19, he enrolled at the University of Puget Sound in South Seattle and later transferred to the University of Washington in downtown Seattle. While in college, Ted began a relationship with a girl named Stephanie Brooks from a wealthy family. Her family didn't approve of Ted, so he dropped out of college and became a driver and bodyguard for government officials. He wanted to pursue a political career, but was ambitious and wanted to achieve success quickly. His girlfriend felt that Ted was immature and her family didn't like him, so they broke up. The sudden breakup was a severe blow to Ted's psyche. This was a major turning point in his life, and he was deeply saddened after the breakup. For some reason, he became curious about his identity and began to investigate. However, after some research, Ted was shocked to discover that the man who had raised him was actually his grandfather. The sadness of the breakup, coupled with this new psychological blow, led him to travel to Colorado and other places to escape his troubles. In the fall of 1969, Ted, then 23, returned to Washington and began dating a 24-year-old single mother named Elizabeth Klopfer. The following year, Ted returned to the University of Washington and majored in psychology. Ted had a high IQ, excelled in his studies, and was well liked by his professors. After graduating, Ted worked at a suicide hotline center in Seattle, where a counselor named Ann Rule and a former Seattle police officer shared with Ted some of the police's methods for handling criminals. This provided valuable experience for his future crimes. Ted then became involved in politics, helping the then governor defeat his opponents and starting a brief political career. By 1973, at the age of 27, Ted had enrolled in law school at the University of Seattle at the suggestion of governors and university professors. Ted was very handsome, charming, young, promising, and had unlimited potential. At that time, Ted was in his glory days and had reconnected with his ex-girlfriend Stephanie, who was also very surprised by Ted's changes. The two soon rekindled their love, but Ted and Elizabeth still maintained a romantic relationship. Both girls were unaware of each other's existence. After dating Stephanie for a while, Ted proposed to her. She was very happy about it and began introducing Ted to her friends as her future husband. Just as the two were about to get married, Ted suddenly cut off all contact with Stephanie. It made her very sad, and all of that was planned by Ted Bundy with the purpose of revenge for their breakup that year. Flashing back to the fall of 1969, 24-year-old Elizabeth was living alone in Seattle with her child. She met Ted at a bar near the university. They chatted at the bar that night and spent the night together. The next morning, Ted personally made breakfast for Elizabeth. Such a man made Elizabeth admire him very much. They often went out together. Ted was very good to Elizabeth's daughter. Occasionally, he would come home early on weekends to take care of her child. He really looked like a father. Elizabeth came from a wealthy family in Utah, and her father was a dentist. After dating for a while, she introduced him to her parents. Ted's polite manner made a good impression on her family. Ted was determined to enter politics or the upper class. In the 5 years with Elizabeth, she got pregnant once, while Ted was still in college, so as not to affect her boyfriend's studies. As time passed, Elizabeth discovered that Ted often dated other girls without letting her know. To get back at him, she also dated another man with the intention of making Ted jealous, but he didn't care. In the end, she could only use alcohol to drown her sorrows. In early 1974, many girls started disappearing in the Seattle area, and the police released a sketch of the suspect to the public. When she saw the sketch, Elizabeth felt that it looked very similar to her boyfriend Ted Bundy. During that time, Ted did not live with Elizabeth, but lived in a rented house nearby to have the conditions to commit crimes. After 2 disappearances, Elizabeth began to suspect and asked her boyfriend directly where he had been that day, but the other party hesitated and was vague, not wanting to answer. In the suspect information released by the police, it was mentioned that the suspect was driving a Beetle, and Ted's car was also a Beetle. Once by chance, Elizabeth accidentally found an axe in his car. Not only that, but she also found a pair of crutches, a bag of plaster, and a sack of women's clothes in Ted's residence. After seeing those items, Elizabeth wanted to know the truth, so she went to confront Ted. But unexpectedly, he directly threatened that if she dared to tell anyone else, he would not spare her. However, Elizabeth told a close friend about the incident. Persuaded by her friend, she took all her courage and called the police. But this was just an unfounded allegation, and the police received similar reports almost every day. So initially they didn't pay much attention. In 1975, Ted went to Salt Lake City, Utah, where another woman was assaulted. Elizabeth felt that it couldn't be a coincidence and that it was definitely him, so she reported it to the police again. This time, the police came to Elizabeth and asked her some questions. Judging from the recent cases, the suspect might have a serious sexual disorder, so the investigators asked Elizabeth personal questions about Ted's sex life. She said that he had a high sex drive and that he also liked to read pornographic books. The police became even more suspicious of Ted, and the next step was to find evidence. In September 1975, after getting a clue, Ted sold his Beetle. The police immediately seized the car and conducted a detailed investigation. As a result, many hairs were found in the car, and forensic analysis showed that they belonged to 3 victims in the series of cases: Melissa Smith, Karine Campbell, and Carol Deronche. Melissa went missing in Utah and was found just the next day with bruises and injuries from a strong impact to the head and had been sexually assaulted. Karine was a professional nurse who disappeared while on vacation in Colorado and was found a month later on a remote road. She was naked, had many open wounds on her body, and like Melissa, she had been sexually assaulted. Although the locations of the 3 cases were different, their hair was found in Ted's car. The Washington State Police contacted the police in several other states. After exchanging information about several cases, they finally discovered that the cases occurring in many places could have been committed by the same person, and that person was Ted Bundy. With the crucial evidence in hand, the police arrested Ted, but he refused to plead guilty and claimed he was innocent. Because the evidence the prosecutor had was limited, it was very difficult to convict Ted, so the prosecutor could only charge Ted with kidnapping. In February 1976, the case was officially brought to trial, and witness Carol testified in court. She stated with certainty that the person who tried to kidnap her that night was the defendant. Because of the crucial evidence of the hair found in his car, the court declared the defendant Ted Bundy guilty of kidnapping and sentenced him to 15 years in prison. After the sentencing, the prosecutors continued to charge Ted with 2 counts of first-degree murder for Melissa and Corinne. Ted was then transferred to Colorado for trial. On June 7, 1977, the case was tried in the Pitkin County District Court in Colorado. Ted requested to represent himself and the judge agreed, releasing Ted from his handcuffs and shackles. Ted went to the library on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, ostensibly to research information, and wandered among the bookshelves. When no one was looking, he dashed to a window and jumped out. It caused him to sprain his ankle, but he could still walk. After leaving the courthouse, he passed through Aspen and headed south towards Aspen Mountain, where Ted stole food, clothing, and a rifle from a mountain house before venturing deep into the forest. After 2 days of evasion, he moved to Maroon Lake, where he stole food and clothing from a camper before continuing to flee. On June 13, 1977, after 6 days on the run, unable to withstand the cold weather and his worsening ankle injury, he decided to steal a car and return to Aspen for treatment. He was then spotted and arrested by 2 patrol officers. He was taken to the Garfield County Jail. Ted's lawyer and friends argued that the current evidence of the prosecution could not prove his guilt. As long as he calmed down, he could still be acquitted, but Ted, knowing the law and having his own ideas, had already planned an escape in his mind. However, escaping was extremely difficult, and he couldn't do it alone. Then he remembered a friend named Carol Boone, a former colleague of Ted's, who had a crush on him for a long time. During a visit to the jail, Carol A. secretly gave Ted some drugs, and Ted sold them to another inmate for $500. Ted then used the money to buy a hacksaw and a drawing of the prison layout. He used his daily shower time to use the hacksaw to cut a hole in the ceiling of his cell. Above was a ventilation pipe, but it was very narrow and could not fit his current size. Ted then lost 16 kg through dieting and was finally able to enter the ventilation pipe. Every night, Ted climbed into the ventilation pipe to scout the way. Other inmates heard the sound coming from above and reported it to the guards. However, the guards thought it might be the sound of rats running across, so they didn't pay much attention. Ted spent many nights exploring the ventilation pipes. Although he didn't find a way out of the prison, he did find the warden's office. A new plan was forming in the killer's mind. On December 30, 1977, it was still a holiday. So many guards were at home celebrating Christmas, making it the most relaxed time of the year for prisons. That day, 31-year-old Ted began his escape. He placed a stack of books on his prison cell bed and covered them with a blanket. From the outside, it looked like a man was sleeping under the blanket. Then he crawled into the ventilation duct on the ceiling. He had to move inch by inch, afraid that he would make a noise and be discovered. Finally, he reached the warden's office. Ted then put on the warden's uniform and walked out of the prison grandly. The next day at noon, when the guards went on patrol, they discovered that Ted had escaped from the prison. At that time, Ted had moved to Chicago. Realizing that he had escaped, the FBI also launched a nationwide manhunt for him. Ted went to Chicago and stayed there for a short time before moving to Florida. There, he rented a room near Florida State University and wanted to hide his identity there to find a job, but because he could not use his real identity, he had to resort to theft. He then committed several burglaries and murders in the area, and the victims were all young, beautiful girls. On February 12, 1978, more than a month after his escape, Ted was broke and couldn't pay the rents, so he stole another car and began to flee. 3 days later, on February 15, he was stopped by the police in the early morning. They found the identification of several female students, many credit cards, and a stolen TV. In 1979, 33-year-old Ted was once again on trial in Florida. To maintain a good image before the jury, Ted asked Carol Boone to testify. Carolee believed that Ted was innocent from the beginning, and the evidence held by the prosecutors was insufficient, so they proposed a plea bargain without a death penalty. That is, Ted had to confess to killing 3 victims and apologize to their families. But Ted considered the plea bargain as a precaution to avoid the death penalty. Ted just wanted more time to find legal loopholes to have the possibility of being acquitted. Ted apologized to the victims' families and finally rejected the plea bargain. In June 1979, the trial began, and hundreds of media outlets waited outside the courthouse. During the trial, witnesses for the prosecution testified that they had seen Ted take out the murder weapon and appear at the crime scene. In addition, bite marks were found on the left buttock of one of the victims, and experts compared the bite marks and found them to be identical to those of the killer. After more than a month of trial, which lasted until July 24, 1979, the case came to an end. The court convicted defendant Ted Bundy of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. The case shocked the entire United States and attracted a lot of media attention. Ted Bundy was handsome and attractive, so his supporters did not believe that he would do such a thing, and some even sent love letters and gifts to the killer in prison. In January 1980, another murder trial involving Ted was held in Orlando. During the trial, Ted's supporters came from all over the United States, and some people gave love letters to the killer's lawyer. After 8 hours of trial, the judge sentenced Ted to death. During his imprisonment, Carolee visited Ted many times. She bribed the guards to have more private time with her lover, and Carolee became pregnant. After the trial, Ted began a lengthy appeals process. He revealed his initial crimes and his change of mind through third-person narratives. Initially, he killed only for property, but later, lust became the main reason. To avoid being reported by the victims, Ted murdered them. He contacted an FBI crime analyst and a biographer. The biographer was shocked by Ted's satisfaction in recounting the murders. Bundy told Special Agent William Hagmaier that he considered himself a career criminal, an impulsive killer in his early years, before moving to a stage he called sophisticated or hunting around the time of Linda Healy's murder in 1974. This implied that Bundy had been killing before 1974, although he never actually admitted it. However, he did not reveal the details of the case from beginning to end until July 1984. The guards saw 2 hacksaws hidden in Ted's cell, so they suspected he was trying to escape. They searched the cell and found that the steel bar on the cell window had been sawed off and glued back on with homemade soap. They then transferred Ted to another cell. A few months later, the guards found illegal mirrors in his cell, and he was transferred again. In October 1984, Ted Bundy contacted Robert Keppel and offered to share his self-proclaimed expertise in the psychology of serial killers as the hunt for the Green River Killer was underway in Washington. The perpetrator was later identified as Gary Ridgway. Keppel and Detective Dave Reichert of the Green River Task Force interviewed Ted Bundy, while Ridgway remained at large for another 17 years. Keppel published a detailed account of the interviews related to the Green River case and later collaborated with Michaud in several reviews of other interview transcripts. Ted's purpose in contacting Robert was only to avoid the death penalty. In April 1986, shortly after announcing a new execution date, Ted Bundy finally confessed to Hagmaier and Nelson what they believed to be all of his most brutal acts. This included details of what he had done to the victims' bodies after they were dead. Him told the two that he would often return to Taylor Mountain, Issaquah, as well as many other secondary crime scenes, to lie with his victims and engage in sexual acts with their decomposing corpses until they began to decompose. In some cases, Ted would drive all night and stay at the scene. In Utah, Ted made up the lifeless face of Melissa Smith and washed Laura Ames' hair repeatedly. After numerous court hearings, the official execution date was set for January 24, 1989. With no further appeals possible and no motivation to deny his crimes, Ted Bundy agreed to talk frankly with investigators. Ted confessed to Keppel that he was the perpetrator of all 8 cases in Washington and Oregon, places where he was a potential suspect. Ted Bundy also described additional victims who had never been found, including 3 in Washington and 2 in Oregon. He refused to identify the names of all 5 victims, if he indeed knew their names. Ted stated that the 5th body he disposed of on Taylor Mountain was that of Donna Manson, but he burned her head in the Cloakfors fireplace. Realizing that no stay of execution would be granted by the court, Ted's fans began lobbying for his last remaining chance, clemency. Diana Weiner, a young lawyer in Florida and believed to be Ted Bundy's last romantic relationship, asked the families of some victims in Colorado and Utah to petition Florida Governor Bob Martinez to stay his execution in order to gather further statements from him. All of them refused. Bundy died in the electric chair at Rayford at 7:16 a.m. on January 24, 1989, ending a 43-year life of a twisted-minded and highly intelligent serial killer who terrorized countless innocent girls.